You hear the scrape of wood on stone. Above you, footsteps. Laughter. The weight presses down. First on your chest, then your ribs. You try to breathe, but the air won't come. And then you realize they're feasting. Right above you. This wasn't fiction. It wasn't myth. It was a sentence. And before we go any further, I have to say, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, from 8 centuries ago, still reaches people everywhere. History isn't just facts, it's feeling. And what you're about to hear, it stayed in the chronicles because no one who recorded it could forget. The year was 1223. The place, the windswept plains near the Kalka River in what is now southern Ukraine. A coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies had just been obliterated by 2 Mongol generals, Subutai and Jebe, operating under the distant command of a man the world had begun to fear, Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols. The battle had been brutal. But what came after the battle? That's where the real horror lived. Among the captured were some of the most powerful men in Rus, Prince Mstislav of Kiev, Prince Mstislav of Chernigov, and others whose names carried weight across the steppes. They had fought with honor. They had lost with dignity. And now they expected the blade. A swift execution. The end reserved for warriors. They did not get it. Instead, the Mongols laid them face down in the dirt, not bound to posts, not lined up for beheading, just placed on the ground, alive, conscious, watching the boots of their captors move around them. And then the Mongols began building. They dragged wooden planks over the bodies, heavy beams, thick platforms. They constructed a banquet floor, directly on top of the living princes. You have to pause here and imagine it, not as a story, as a moment. You are a prince. You've ruled cities. You've commanded armies. And now your face is in the dust, and you feel the weight of wood settling onto your back. You hear hammering. You hear orders shouted in a language you don't fully understand. And then, footsteps, many of them. The Mongol commanders sat down to feast. They ate. They drank. They celebrated their victory with toasts and songs, the way conquerors do. And beneath them, with every movement, every shift of weight, the princes were slowly crushed. There was no blood. That was the point. In Mongol tradition, especially under the legal code known as the Yasa, which Genghis Khan had established, it was sometimes considered taboo to spill the blood of nobility directly, not out of mercy, out of ritual. So they found a way to kill that honored the letter of the law while obliterating its spirit. The Russian Primary Chronicle, one of the earliest records of the Rus people, confirms it. So do Persian sources, including the chronicler Ata Malik Juvayni, who followed the Mongol campaigns across Asia and recorded what others tried to forget. He wrote that the Mongols placed boards upon them and sat to feast while the princes were pressed into the earth. It wasn't quick. As the feast dragged on, hours perhaps, the pressure increased. Ribs cracked, lungs collapsed, breathing became impossible, and when the Mongols finally stood and dismantled the platform, the princes were dead, crushed under the weight of their conqueror's celebration. This wasn't rage, it wasn't chaos, it was designed. But why? To understand that, you have to understand what Genghis Khan had built. He didn't just lead an army, he engineered a system. An empire held together not by castles or roads, but by fear, loyalty, and an unshakable belief in order. The Yasa wasn't just law, it was philosophy. It said, betray us, and you don't just die. You become a lesson. And the lesson at Kalka wasn't for the dead princes. It was for everyone else. News of what happened spread like wildfire across the Rus territories, into Poland, into Hungary. It reached the courts of Europe. It was whispered in markets and recorded in monasteries. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. Do not resist the Mongols. Because if you do, your death will not be honorable. It will be humiliating, public, unforgettable. This was psychological warfare at its most refined. But the Khalkha execution was just one note in a much larger symphony of terror. Genghis Khan didn't invent cruelty, but he systematized it. He turned punishment into policy. He made suffering predictable, and that predictability became a weapon in itself. Take siege starvation. When the Mongols surrounded a city, they didn't just cut off food. They studied it. Mongol engineers were trained to calculate how long a population could survive on stored grain, how quickly desperation would set in, and exactly when the psychological breaking point would arrive. They poisoned wells. They burned surrounding farmland. They created perimeters so tight that not even a bird could fly in with a message. In 1219, during the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongols besieged the city of Nishapur. For weeks, nothing happened. No assault, no bombardment. Just waiting. Inside the walls, the people ate their reserves, then their animals, then leather, then anything they could chew. Juvayni, the Persian chronicler, described cities where none remained to bury the corpses, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful. In some places, survivors were found eating the dead, and when the gates finally opened, either through surrender or collapse, the Mongols didn't spare the starving. They massacred them, or enslaved them. The message was clear: surrender early or die slowly. It wasn't just about taking a city. It was about making the next city surrender without a fight. And it worked. Dozens of cities across Central Asia opened their gates the moment Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon. They had heard the stories. They had seen the refugees. They knew what resistance cost. But if you did resist, and if you were captured, your fate depended on who you were. If you were a woman, your fate was perhaps the cruelest of all. After the fall of Bukhara in 1220, thousands of women and girls were seized. They were sorted, ranked, judged by age, beauty, and social standing. The wives and daughters of nobles were set aside for Mongol generals. Some were taken into Genghis Khan's own household. Others were distributed among officers as rewards. Lower-ranking women were divided among the soldiers or forced into labor camps. Many were sold. Juvayni wrote that they separated the men from the women, the children from their mothers, and drove them into camps like herds of sheep. This wasn't metaphor. It was process. And the goal wasn't just conquest. It was erasure. To take a man's city was one thing. To take his wife, his daughter, his lineage, that was to erase his legacy entirely. It was domination at the level of identity. Some women were incorporated into Mongol households through forced marriage. Others disappeared into the vast trade networks that spanned the empire, sold into slavery from the steppes of Central Asia to the courts of China. A few kept their names. Most did not. Their suffering is one of the least discussed but most devastating legacies of the Mongol expansion. Not because it was unique to the Mongols, war has always brutalized women, but because it was executed with the same industrial efficiency that defined every other aspect of Genghis Khan's empire. And then there were the human shields. At the siege of Gurganj in 1221, as Mongol forces prepared to assault the city walls, they did something that froze the defenders in horror. They pushed thousands of captured civilians, men, women, children, ahead of their own troops. These weren't hostages used for negotiation. They were tools. Human barriers meant to absorb the first wave of arrows, exhaust the enemy's ammunition, and create chaos on the walls. Defenders had to choose: kill their own people, or hold fire and let the Mongols advance unopposed. Juvayni recorded it with chilling clarity. They used the people of one city to batter down the next. Some captives were tied together to prevent escape. Others were forced to carry siege equipment, dig trenches, or fill moats, all while under fire from their own side. If they survived the assault, they were often killed afterward. They had served their purpose. This tactic didn't just weaken defenses. It shattered morale. It turned warfare into a nightmare where every act of resistance meant killing your own neighbors. And it was policy. Not the rage of a single commander, not a one-time atrocity. It was repeated across dozens of sieges, from Persia to China to Eastern Europe. For Genghis Khan, war wasn't about honor. It was about results. And if the result required sacrificing thousands of innocents to break a city's will, then that wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. But there was one punishment reserved for a very specific crime: betrayal. If you were a traitor, a spy, a defector, a governor who surrendered and then resisted, you were tied to the back of a horse, not thrown over it, not dragged quickly to your death, tied, hands bound, sometimes limbs dislocated to ensure you couldn't resist. And then the horse was spurred forward, you were pulled across the ground, over rocks, through dust, for minutes, sometimes longer. It was public, it was irreversible, and it left a message behind. A mutilated body discarded in front of city gates as a warning to anyone else considering betrayal. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was about order. Under the Yasa, loyalty to the Khan was absolute. Anyone who endangered that unity was a threat to the entire system, and threats were eliminated in ways that ensured no one would follow their example. Execution wasn't chaos, it was communication. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and it had been built not just on strategy and speed, but on fear. Fear that was calculated, engineered, deployed with precision. The chroniclers couldn't forget. Giovanni, writing decades later, summarized the Mongol campaigns in a single, haunting line. They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed. But they didn't just depart. They left behind a memory, a scar in the collective consciousness of every culture they touched. The stories were recorded not because they were unusual, but because they were unforgettable. And here's the paradox that still haunts historians today. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, also created unprecedented trade networks, religious tolerance, and cultural exchange. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Ideas, technologies, and art moved freely across a vast and connected world. But that world was built on submission, and submission was built on terror. So the question isn't whether Genghis Khan was cruel. It's whether cruelty, when systematized and applied with ruthless consistency, can actually build something that lasts. The princes at Khalkha couldn't answer that. They died under the weight of a banquet they would never taste. But their story survived, and 8 centuries later, we're still talking about it. Not because it's shocking, but because it forces us to ask, how much of history's greatest empires were built not on what they created, but on what they made others too terrified to resist? The feast ended. The platform was lifted. The bodies were left where they fell, and the Mongols rode on.